Hi, everybody. I wanted to talk a little bit today about social workers in the criminal justice field. So, thinking about criminal justice, what do social workers do if they go into that field? They may be do community-based rehabilitation, help people re-enter into the community after they leave jail or prison. They may become probation officers, parole officers. They may work as counselors within a jail or within treatment facilities if there are people who are sent there for drug or mental health problems because they got involved with law enforcement. They can work for police agencies, and we can talk a little bit about that. And they may also work with victims of crimes, which is a big field. In order to do that, if you're going to be a social worker in the criminal justice field, you really do need to have a general sense of how courts work, and how courtrooms work, about how the justice system and appeals and things work within our system. You would learn more as you got involved. You'll need to know a little bit of a focus on involuntary clients, because clients who have been involved with the criminal justice system, oftentimes they're working with social workers because they have to. And working with involuntary clients can be very different than working with voluntary clients. And they want to know a little bit about what leads to crime and delinquency, which I'm going to talk about a little bit, but there are a lot of theories of that out there. So what are the three main parts of the criminal justice system? We call them the 3 C's. They're control, convict, and contain. So control is the police job. They try to control people's behavior by being there, by arresting people. The courts then convict people. That's where we decide if guilt or innocence. And then it would be the jails and prisons that contain people. That's where, obviously, we keep them to keep the community safe. There are 2 kinds of crimes. There's misdemeanors and felonies. I'm wondering if you know the difference. Usually, if it is a felony, it's something that is sentenced, requires a year or more in jail. It can prevent you from voting while you are in jail. It can also prevent you from some kind of jobs in the future. Another thing that you may hear about as a criminal justice employee are the UCR. Those are the Uniform Crime Reports, UCR. The Uniform Crime Reports come out annually to tell us what the crime rate is. Things are going up, things are going down. You may have heard across the country for years now, for about 4 years since the pandemic, crime has been decreasing in every avenue, everywhere, which is a good thing. There is some evidence that there's some juvenile delinquency that has gone up a little bit, and it's about going up equal amounts between girls and boys. But generally, the UCR will tell you the crime reports. Now, the one thing is, they tell about the crime. They don't tell about whether anybody necessarily was caught with the crime, if anybody was convicted with the crime. They just tell you what the number is. They also don't tell you the story behind the situation. So you can't always use them as a great way to know what's going on in a community. What you should know about crime is that we right now have 1.6 million people in federal prison or state prison, and we have 800,000 people in jails. Generally, jails are where you go while you wait for a trial, or if you've been sentenced for 2 years or less. Over 2 years, in most places, you go onto the state system. The United States is the most incarcerated country in the world. 1 out of every 100 people in the United States is in jail or prison. 1 out of every 35 people are monitored by the criminal justice system, parole, probation, electronic monitoring. So that's a full 2% of our population. So it is a decent amount. Minorities are very overrepresented in the jails. 1 in 32 are white. 1 in 6 inmates are black. 1 in 22 inmates are Hispanic. So you can see there is definitely a racial compilation there that needs to be figured out. In their lifetime, 33%, a third of black men can expect to have been sent to jail, 17% of Hispanic men, but only 4.4% of white men. So that should be telling a story right there too. Early theorists on crime, why people thought people committed crime. The most early that is recorded is Cesar Lombroso. Cesar Lombroso believed it was related to physical characteristics. He believed people had lumps on their brain and that they would feel the skulls of people who'd been convicted of crimes, and that predicted in the future who would be a criminal. That did not last long. He also used to believe that they were physically large with large foreheads. Later, after that, and when Freud came about, we started to think that crime came about because of mental health issues, which is true. That often can be. There can be the fog of mental illness that can lead to behaviors that is crime, or there can be events in one's childhood that can lead to trauma and things that predispose someone more to crime. In the 60s, we started looking more at social issues and realizing the impact that poverty had on crime, that living in a ghetto had in crime, in not having equal opportunity for jobs was all having on crime. At labeling, and I think I mentioned this in a previous lecture, that when people are labeled as a certain behavior, they tend to start to fit that label after a while. I wanted to talk for a minute about something called the broken windows theory, which was developed, I think it was in the late 70s or 80s, but it's kind of held true. This idea is that when a neighborhood is starting to deteriorate, it deteriorates to the point of crime, and then the crime continues. So what this man did when he did an investigation is he parked a car in Palo Alto, California, and he parked a car in the Bronx in New York, and he let them sit there. And within 24 hours, somebody broke into the car in New York. They smashed the window. Within 48 hours, other windows had been smashed, and anything in the car had been taken out. Within another 24 hours, kids were playing in the car. There was nothing left of the car. The car in Palo Alto sat there for 2 weeks until he finally came and knocked the window out himself to see what would happen. Shortly after that, somebody else knocked a window out, and basically that was the end of what happened with that car. So he then took that and looked around inner cities where the crime rate was particularly high, and he noticed they had factories that were closed, doors hanging off, homes with windows broken out, and that's when he came up with the broken window theory. And so that idea is that when something happens, when you start to have broken windows, when you start to have cars dilapidated and left on the streets, when there's graffiti that isn't immediately cleaned up, quickly the town, the city will start to deteriorate and become more of a crime zone. We see that here in Bucks County. When there was graffiti, we try to get the Towns Against Graffiti machine right out there right away to clean it up, because once there's graffiti somewhere, it goes on and it's somewhere else. You can see that in certain neighborhoods too, and this is where the broken theories goes to ownership theory, that when there's a lot of renters in a neighborhood, a lot of times the people who own those houses don't worry about taking care of them. So they start to have broken windows and they become more dilapidated. The people who start to live in those homes have less and less income, and there starts to be more and more crime. So there's a big emphasis on that's why people should have home ownership, because when somebody owns their home, there's a desire to keep it in good shape, because you might want to sell it and you want to get your money back and you want to maybe make money on it. So people who actually own the home and live in the home tend to take better care of things. So that's where that sociological theory of crime came from. There's also a whole other, let me skip it this way. Let me say that over the past 40 years, politics and crime, it may be 50 years now, politics and crime have kind of mixed. 5 factors have led to crime being something that people talk about and that politicians use to get elected. One thing is that this country has had a long-standing value and belief that people can make it if they work hard enough. So that value tends to think of people who commit crimes as people who didn't work hard enough, so they should be punished. There's also some modern racism that's related to criminal arrests. Once we had the civil rights movement and civil rights came out and we started to tell people not to be racist and teach them how not to do it, there became this underlying way to be racist, and that is to have more people of color that are in our jails and prisons. There is a lot of media attention to crime. So people tend to think that there's more crime than there really is because of the media. There is a lock them up and throw away the key mentality that has happened. And then there is the drug wars. And that is probably the basic main reason why our prisons went from spending $20 billion on crime control, ready, in 1970, $20 billion in 1970, to over $150 billion last year. That's right. Our prisons, meanwhile, went from 7 billion people to 50 billion. So that's how many people were going in and out. So this is how this started. And you think about it, 86% of the people in jail and prisons are there related to some kind of drug offense or drug use that they were arrested for. So we go back to when Richard Nixon ran for office, and so that would be like 1968. And that was when we were coming out of, or in the middle of the Civil Rights Movement, the Vietnam War opposition that was out there. So there was a lot of right-wing conservative people who had kind of had it with hippies and stuff. And so Richard Nixon took advantage of that from a political way, and he told people there was crime everywhere, and that they voted for him. He was going to get rid of, these hippies, the protests, the crime, and they bought it, and it worked. And ever since then, anybody who's run for public office, especially the higher up offices, always turns around and blames crime. Even here in the county, I've been running for office since 2008, so I've run 5 or 6 times now. Every single time they will say that I am going to bring Philadelphia crime to Bucks County, which is interesting because I'm born and raised in Bucks County. I never spent any time in Philadelphia, but that is the buzzword. It's never worked. I've always gotten reelected, but it goes to show how important crime is as a tool in the politician's box there. So how did it happen? As I said, there was Nixon. He had that, war on drugs is kind of what he said. And that began everybody thinking about it. The next thing that happened was Ronald Reagan ran in 1982. So he runs again. We're already into this war on drugs and blaming everything on crime. But he really went into the crack cocaine thing. And I'm going to attach a video that I want you to watch. It's by Jay-Z. And it pretty much is going to tell you what I'm telling you right now. But there was crack being used and cocaine being used in the 80s. They're the same thing, right? Crack cocaine is cocaine, and crack cocaine is just a version that has been cooked down, and it's cheaper, and it was more readily available in ghetto and poor areas. So being alive back then, I remember that the police were just crazy in the city. They were knocking down doors, breaking into houses, and there was arrests on crack all the time. Constantly it was about the crack, and the crackheads. But there was nothing going on up in the suburbs and the wealthier areas of city where everybody was doing cocaine. So it became the war on drugs and the war on crime. Ronald Reagan ran on the idea that he and his wife were going to put into effect with drugs, just say no. Some of you may have had DARE officers in your schools when you were younger. That came from that movement. So it worked. Here we spent all this time and money on crack cocaine, ignoring cocaine, and actually it filled the jails. And it filled the jails with people of color and people who were poor. Important to remember that the people in the cities who were more poor were also more dependent on public defenders who had hundreds and hundreds of clients. Were the few people who in the non-ghetto areas who were using cocaine and got arrested were able to hire very lawyers that were expensive and were able to do a little bit more from them. The next movement was Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton, then a Democrat, came out and said he was going to do something about crime. And in fact, he did pass the 1994 Clinton crime bill, they called it. The interesting thing is the Black Caucus went to him and said, hey, this is what we need in that crime bill. We need basketball leagues at night. We need different interventions with the police. But Bill Clinton didn't do any of that. He acquiesced and put all of it into police. And we added 100,000 police officers that year. I can tell you I was an elected township supervisor in Middletown then, and it was great. it was all this free money to buy cops. And so we hired, I think, 3 cops, bought them bikes. We made them bike cops so they were on the street. I don't think that those bike cops are around anymore, but it goes to show that they found money, but it was really focused a lot on drugs. So watch that video. It's very brief, but it's another good video that kind of explains things. The next thing I wanted to just touch on basically was the trends that we've had in corrections, in terms of jails and prisons. So over time, and I'm old enough that I've seen this switch a few times, the first reason that that there's a trend to putting people in jails is community safety. So that's it. That's obvious. If you lock people up, they can't hurt anybody. The second reason that we lock people up, and this has been a big trend at times, has been retribution. It's to punish that person for what they did. It's to say an eye for an eye. You caused pain and suffering, and now we're going to cause pain and suffering for you. In the early days when they would brand people, put them in stocks, cut out their tongue, all of that is obvious retribution. If you stole something, they would cut off your hand, they say. Actually, that fits in even better with deterrence, which is the next movement. Deterrence was that if you see that I cut off his hand because he stole bread, you're not going to steal any bread. So deterrence is that you will be so fearful of prison or what we will do to you that you will behave. Rehabilitation became the next movement, and that was really, again, of course, there was a time that this happened, probably in the late 1700s, early 1800s, with the Quakers getting involved in correction system, and they built things like Eastern State Penitentiary. But we saw it again in the 60s and 70s, and that's the idea that you want to help people who are in jail enter society with vocational skills and education. We try to teach people what skill is useful in the communities where they'll be returning to. The other trend, and that's related to this, is reintegration. And that's trying to get people to go back home out of jail by being in a halfway house, or being on extended probation, or having an electronic monitor. Or the new thing today is there's a map on your cell phone that tells somebody where you are all the time, and it can be monitored. So that's it. Wanted to tell you one other word, that's recidivism. Recidivism is the repeating of crime. That means that the recidivism rate is how often people go back to jail. You're a recidivist if you get out of jail and get arrested 6 months later. I'm hoping that makes sense. I did want to chat for just a little bit about, first of all, about victims. That's another thing that social workers can get into. If you go into victim advocacy, you are working with victims from the beginning to the end. You can be the therapist that's helping them to deal with any post-traumatic stress disorder that happens. You can walk them through the court system, telling them each step of the way. A lot of times victim advocates stay in touch with the district attorney or the police to be able to keep giving people information. That includes giving people education about what's happening out there. A lot of times victim advocates work with people to prepare their victim impact statements when there is a trial or something in front of a judge, and they are allowed to tell the judge or the jury how they experienced this crime that happened to them. And they also work with people to get them prepared for when their person who hurt them or victimized them is going to get out of jail. I did want to talk a little bit about a couple other options we have out there to try to avoid getting people in jail. One is we are now training people across the country. We started doing this in Bucks County, I think, in 2009, training police officers in CIT, crisis intervention training. So it's actually social workers who are training them and giving them de-escalation skills. So that has been very helpful. We also have treatment courts. That's people, instead of going and doing their time in jail, they are instead going to a court, and they see a judge once a week, then every other week, then every month, who monitors how they're doing. One court is for people who have mental health problems that got them involved with crime, and we call that wellness court. And the other one that we have, which we call recovery court, is for people who got involved with drugs. The other thing I wanted to say about that is we have started a program in Bucks County, and I will take some credit for this one because it's something that I wanted to do for a really long time. I had an experience when I was in graduate school working for the Trenton Police Department where they had a social worker in their police department, and I always wanted that to come to Bucks County. So in 2020, when I got elected with Commissioner Bob Harvey and DiGirolamo, we were able to bring that to fruition. So we have 39 police departments in Bucks County, and so right now I think we are in 31 police departments. The remaining ones, 3 of them are struggling to buy into this, and the other 5 are boroughs, small boroughs, and really are just unable to really participate in this. But the idea is that we have a social worker embedded in these police departments. So when a police officer is called to a situation of domestic violence, when they're called to a situation of suicide, when there's a child abuse incident, a lot of times when there is issues with, say, someone who's elderly and they're calling the police constantly, or they're having some kind of behavior acting out because there's some dementia, that's when, instead of a police officer, you really need a social worker. And what we have found is we can get the police officers back on the street because they don't really have the skills to be a social worker or the resources to know how to help people. Homelessness, that's another one that we're finding the social workers have the answers to. So in some places like Bensalem, they had 2 co-responders. Middletown Township has 1, Falls has 1, but we do have Tullytown, Bristol Borough, and Bristol Township sharing a co-responder. We have 7 of the Upper Bucks townships sharing 1 co-responder. So it works. They go back and forth. One police department might not have problems for days, and then someone will. I work with them all the time. It's been wonderful. A lot of the police were kind of thinking they didn't want to do this when we first came up with the idea because they don't want some social worker coming into their calls. But they have found since having them that they like this. It gets things off of their shoulders. And for social workers, it's great because we are able to intervene before someone gets arrested and maybe get them the mental health help that they need. The final thing is that you are going to see, and I think it's in the next module, I put something called 40 Assets, which I think I referred to when I was talking about mental health. But it's helpful in terms of creating communities where people not only are mentally well, but they're also not having that need to act out, whether they're juveniles or adults, in any kind of crime. So thank you, and take a look at the videos I left.